Hi, I'm Patrick, and welcome back to Comparative Politics. In this, my last lecture on the course, we will do something that's slightly different from the other lectures you've had before, and that is that we will change our unit of analysis. In most of the previous lectures, our unit of analysis, the thing that we analyze comparatively, has been the state, so we've compared countries with each other effectively. What we'll do today is we will change focus and we will compare world regions with each other, and we'll think about what we can generate, what insights we can generate from a comparative perspective on those. So regional integration is our topic today, and so in this particular case, I don't mean region as in a subnational region, as in Wales v Scotland v England, but I mean world regions such as Asia or the Americas, for example. And the way that we'll structure this is we will define what a region is first and foremost, and what regionalism and regionalization are, the processes that come along with it. We'll then look at some variation in regional organizations, so we'll look at a couple of different ones around the world, and we'll then think how we theoretically and empirically can approach this phenomenon in a comparative sense. So what do we have to do to compare regions fruitfully? So let's start first, as always, with a little bit of a definition. What is a region? Now, Nye gives us the very bare bones definition of this, and he says that it's simply a limited number of states linked together by a geographical relationship and by a degree of mutual interdependence. A limited number of states, so we can't just call the entire world a region. That wouldn't make much sense. There also has to be a geographical relationship, so they have to sort of be together in the same geographical area. And there has to be a degree of interdependence between them. So, just saying that 5 countries around the Indian Ocean, for example, form a region isn't enough yet. Even if the geography is there, there also has to be some interdependence, some relationships between the countries. If I had made you draw a map of the world regions, you might have come up with something similar to the thing on the right that you see here. So we see the classic kind of splitting up of the world in sort of roughly the Americas here. On this side, we see Africa here, Europe, and Asia. And you can already see from my poor drawing that maybe this is not quite that clear cut, because of course we could, for example, split up North and South America. We could split sub-Saharan Africa from Africa north of the Sahara. We could split South Asia from East Asia, and so on. Now, generally speaking, there tends to be micro-region and macro-regions, and for the most part in this particular lecture, we talk about macro-regions of the world. There's no real clear distinction between these definitorially. And so how we can come up with a good definition of macro-regions is that they are units that are somewhere in between just the national level, but also below the global level. So they have to be subdivisions of the world in a sense. These should be geographically contiguous countries, so that means they should all be essentially touching each other. They should be next to each other in some sense, although I put a little asterisk there because there's also slightly other ways of defining a region. If you think, for example, about the states that all have rainforest, so the equatorial region of the world, those states might all have quite a bit in common. There might even be a degree of interdependence between them, but those are not all states that are next to each other, that have common borders, for example, because they're split along, they're split across South America, Africa, and Asia. But normally we say they have to be geographically contiguous, so they have to share borders. They're not states, obviously, these types of regions, but they might exhibit some state-like features if they have regional organizations that have a certain degree of authority and independence. And there has to be a form of interdependence between those states. We already saw that in the Nye definition. So politically, economically, or socially, there has to be a relation between these countries. Now, as you see in the map already, and as I said just now, where you draw the borders is a little bit up to you. So regions essentially are social constructs. If it would be as easy as there being sort of natural lines of division along all these regions, then we would not have our work cut out for us, then everything would be easy. But to a degree, we ourselves have to decide which country fits in what particular region where those borders are. One of the most famous cases might be Turkey, right? Is Turkey a European country? Is it a Central Asian country? Is it part of the Middle East, for example? And you can sort this into these different categories more or less depending on your own wishes, in a way. The same goes for some countries in South Asia, for example, or whether we treat the Americas as one whole region, for example, or whether we split North America from South America and what we gain by this. So it depends very much on the actors' perceptions and interpretations of this region, where they feel they belong. So states sometimes decide very consciously which region they want to belong to and which region they want to attach themselves to. So it's a social construct. It's not a given thing where the borders of the regions lie. Now, there's two different processes that are related to regions that make them interesting to us as political scientists. And that is regionalization and regionalism. So what do those two things mean? The first is regionalization. That is maybe the thing that you immediately thought of when you thought about regions. That is essentially the processes of cooperation, of integration, and cohesion. So those are all the relationships that happen within a geographical area, within a region, all the processes that then can create a regional space. So of course, Europe, for example, or even Western Europe, didn't consider itself necessarily one region. That was a gradual process. The same is happening in other world regions. So for example, Africa, the idea that all of Africa was one big region, for example, with processes of cooperation and integration, is a relatively new one. That certainly wasn't the case if you go back more than 100 years, say. So these are the empirical phenomena, like on the ground. These are people moving, these are goods moving, these are political corporations being formed, and so on. So those are the things that make this into a regional space. And then you might or might not have on top of this regionalism. So those are now the actual political projects of constructing regions as their own entities and the cooperation that comes along with it. So mostly this takes the shape of political or formal legal arrangements. So one example, of course, is the European Union. The European Union is an outcome of regionalism as a project. So the idea that political actors decide that these processes of regionalization have become powerful enough and the countries have been intertwined enough that you should also create a regional political project. Now this can take the form of formal projects, so institutionalization, actual political entities such as the European Union that then are charged with caring for or further integrating a region, but it can also be informal. So for example, non-state actors can promote this, businesses can promote the idea of this wider region, for example, and create their own regional projects. So for example, you might have a European Federation of car manufacturers that don't necessarily need the EU, but clearly they've decided that Europe as a region has something in common, so it's fruitful for them to all get together and discuss things. And so what I've just said is exactly that, namely that social and cultural processes of integration, so regionalization, and the political side of this, regionalism, aren't always the same. So there might be regions where you have a very high degree of regionalization, there is a lot of exchange going on, but not a lot of regionalism, so not a ton of regional political projects. You could, on the other hand, also have regions that all have regionalism without there actually having been much regionalization. So that's sometimes the case in Central Asia, for example, where you actually don't have as intense exchange processes between countries, but still quite a high number of regional projects, political projects already. So regionalization and regionalism as the two processes that you see and that are not always coterminous here. Now, we're political scientists, so we're always on the hunt for theories. Theories of regional integration are something that you have heard already if you took ISEB. I think almost all of you that are watching this took ISEB, so some of this will sound very familiar. We wanted to explain why regions were politically integrating themselves. Why did this happen? Why were these political projects created on top of processes of regionalization? And so the old regionalism, old theories of regionalism, essentially were just theories that were explaining European integration, because there was very little else out there that was that we were supposed to explain. So Haas in 1970 comes up with this definition of these old theories of regional integration, is that the study of regional integration is concerned with explaining how and why states cease to be wholly sovereign. That's already a pretty loaded definition, right? I mean, so he essentially already assumes that states have ceased to be completely sovereign, and that part of that sovereignty now has been given to regional integration projects such as the European Union, or at the time, the European Community. As you might or might not remember from ICEP, you also know that there's two big strands of explanations that were designed to capture European integration. So that's where the whole field started. We have functional explanations and we have intergovernmental explanations. Functional explanations essentially, and neo-functional ones too, essentially say that there are functional reasons for states to cooperate. So states want a specific outcome, therefore they pool their resources and they can then address problems that they all share. And once you've started integrating on a particular problem or topic, that then tends to spill over. So once you've discovered that you are cooperating, for example, in agriculture, you discovered that you probably should also cooperate on environmental matters, or on matters of workplace safety, or on matters of export restrictions and so on. And that then creates its own momentum. So because you've started integrating in one place, and that has then spilled over into ever more areas in which you integrate, and that develops sort of it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes a perpetually moving process that then also socializes actors into believing that this integration is a good thing, thereby driving integration further because they now have shared norms and goals. So in essence, it means that the EU will essentially just keep going more or less independently of whether states want this or not. On the other hand, you had people that suggested that intergovernmentalism could explain regional integration, and that basically just said that governments were still very much in control, they were self-interested, and they were making the rational choice to give certain authorities to a higher body such as the European Union, and that this was perfectly rational because what they needed was an agent that was doing their bidding. So they simply didn't want to bother with some things themselves as the principals. They wanted to charge an agent with executing those things. And so in a sense, the EU rescued the nation state, at least according to Millward, because in the intergovernmentalist view, the EU essentially allowed states another avenue to exert their influence because they were still very much in control of the process. So these two theories came out of European studies. Now, of course, this has a big problem, and that is that, as Hurrell points out in 2005, that the study of comparative regionalism, so technically of comparing regionalism all across the world, has been hindered by so-called theories of regionalism, which turn out to be little more than the translation of a particular set of European experiences into a more abstract theoretical language. So essentially what he's charging the early theorists with is they just took the European Union, they made a theory that explained the European Union, and then they pretended like that theory would also explain other projects of regionalism all across the world. Now, we can't do that, of course, because we formed our theories of integration with an n of 1. So we had only one case here, and that one case was the European Union, that was European integration, and theories that are built on only one case have very low chances that they can be generalized to all other phenomena in the issue area. So, in other words, how can we explain things that are not the EU? That was the big task that we set for the theorists that had to come with better explanations here. So Eurocentric comparisons, of course, are in the same category of problem. So even if our theories aren't necessarily just built on the EU, always comparing everything to the EU comes with its own set of challenges. So for example, it privileges a specific style of regionalism, and that is the one that the EU pioneered. So are we always just comparing all other regions to one specific pathway of regional organization? And even worse, if we're comparing other regions, are we then basically just measuring everything with the EU yardstick and saying, well, they haven't yet reached the EU's level of regionalism, they're underdeveloped compared to the EU, they're falling short of the model, and so on. And that, of course, is in itself problematic, because if you take a critical perspective to it, there's nothing necessarily that should privilege the EU in that way. There could well be other well-working models that are perfectly applicable to other world regions. And with this narrative that not only do all our theories of regionalism come from European integration, but also we always compare everything to the EU, we essentially reinforce this notion that the European way is superior to others, and we are therefore taking part in the performativity of social science. So we are being a part of the problem, in essence, when we probably should be the solution by not over-privileging any one particular world region. So what this means essentially is that we have to move away from Europe. We have to look at other things than Europe, and we have to stop measuring everything against Europe as the yardstick. Because that then allows us also to take a better stock of the variation that exists around the world in the patterns of regionalism and in the patterns of regionalisation. So, in short, there is more to the world than the European Union and Europe as a region. Now, to illustrate this a little bit more, let me show you a couple of graphs here. So, obviously, regionalism is a global phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that is not just a European one. If you look at the world here, you can see that there's a stacked graph here. You see the overall numbers of regional organizations. We have the first regional organizations starting all the way right after the Second World War here. And we've now reached a level, at least according to our count. So my colleagues and me, who are in a research project I'm going to tell you more about in a second, we've now sort of found between 70 and 80 regional organizations all the way up here in today's world. You see a couple of things. Not all world regions have the same amount of regional organizations. You see, for example, Europe here seems to have quite a lot, as do the Americas and Africa, while other world regions such as Asia here tend to have fewer, and that includes the Middle East, for example, and also Eurasia, so Central Asia. The other thing that you can see is that the development of regional organizations over time hasn't been linear. So yes, it's gone up, but it's not gone up in a straight line. You have a couple of so-called waves of regional integration that have been identified. So one is, for example, right here in the late 50s and early 60s. You have another huge rise in regional organizations starting here after the end of the Cold War. And then at least some observers have said there has been a third wave since the 2000s, but at least according to how my colleagues and me count this, we can't really see that. So it depends a little bit on how you define a regional organization, what counts as a regional organization when you see it. But at least according to our estimates, there has so far not been another wave. And the question, of course, is, are we just going to see more and more regional organizations as time passes, or are we seeing a certain consolidation? And I'm going to tell you more about that in a slide or two. Now, you might actually know a couple of regional organizations outside of the European Union. You might have known that there is such a thing called the African Union. You might know Mercosur if you've ever been in Latin America. You might know ASEAN if you're sitting in South Asia or you're interested in that particular region. You will probably know NAFTA because it's something that's been in the news quite a bit in recent years. But I also would venture that you probably haven't heard of a couple of others. So the Gulf Cooperation Council was something that came up really briefly in the last live stream last week, but you probably haven't heard of that. Then again, have you heard of all the regional organizations in Africa, for example? SADC, IGAD, ECOWAS, CIMAC, and so on. Did you know that there was such a thing as the Pacific Islands Forum that collects not only Australia and New Zealand, but also all the small island nations all across the Pacific, and so on. This is a very reduced picture. There's many more regional organizations in the world, over 70, than you see on this map. So it's truly a global phenomenon. Now, there's a couple of things that are slightly funny about regional organizations. Normally, maybe, you kind of expect that each state might only be part of one regional organization. Or if you put this the other way around, each region, however you define that, should probably have one regional organization that is attached to it, that is responsible for it. But in practice, we don't see that. In practice, we see the phenomenon of overlapping regionalism. And this is actually something that's been really hard to explain in recent years. Just as an example, I'm going to give you a couple. So here, for example, you see all the states that are part of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. That's the big circle all the way here around. So that's the big circle here is the OIC, which collects all the states of the world that have a significant minority or a majority of Muslim populations. By the way, this is one of those organizations where the states aren't geographically all bordering each other. This is essentially a religious definition of a region, which the OIC is one of the very few around the world that do it that way. And you see that this goes all the way from sort of Uganda here in Africa, all the way over to, I think this is the Seychelles here in the Indian Ocean. So it's in Brunei down here and all these other, like Pakistan and so on. So there's a good number of countries in here, but that's actually not the interesting part. The interesting part is if you picked any one country here, so let's pick Lebanon here, for example, you can see that Lebanon is actually not just part of the OIC here, but it's also part of a number of other organizations. It's also part of something called the Parliamentary Union of OIC member states. It's also a member of the Arab League and the Council of Arab Economic Unity. Let's pick Turkey down here, for example. You will see that Turkey is not only a member of the Turkic Council, but also of something called the Economic Cooperation Organization. It's also a member of the Parliamentary Union of OIC member states and of the OIC itself. Now, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation isn't the exception here. We can go to any other world regions. For example, let's go to the world region of Africa, and this includes the whole continent of Africa now. You can see, once I erase all my ink here from the slide, you can see that this is a complete spaghetti bowl of regional organizations. So you can have a country such as Somalia here, who is a member of IGAD, it's also a member of CENSAT, it's also a member of the African Union, and so on. And you can do this for any number of countries here. You will find almost no country on the African continent that is in fact only a part of one regional organization. They are all members of several. And it's also not an African phenomenon. I can show you this is the Americas here. And again, you can see that a country such as Cuba down here, or Uruguay, let's pick Uruguay up here, is a member not only of Mercosur, but also of ALADI, CELA, CELAC, the OAS, and so on. So there tends to be an overlapping regionalism. States tend to seemingly really like joining regional organizations. Now, I'm sure you have a couple of ideas of why they would, or what the advantage would be for them, but maybe we can discuss that a little bit more in the live stream. But maybe just think for yourself, why would states join different regional organizations? What could be the motivation? Because we have to assume that not all these regional organizations are the same. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is I want to take a slightly closer look at a couple of specific regional organizations in different world regions outside of Europe to show you that they are sometimes quite far apart from the European Union. And don't worry, I'm not doing that thing where I compare everything to Europe. I'm just using Europe as an example because it's the organization that you will be most familiar with. So let's start in Northern Africa here with the Arab League, the AL. The Arab League has been around for a very long time, since 1945. So at this point, it's over 75 years old, and it was actually founded before the United Nations. So the Arab League is older than the United Nations itself, and actually, fun fact, well, probably not so fun fact, depending on what parties you go to, the experts from the Arab League were consulted when the United Nations wrote its charter. So there were some people that came over essentially to New York or to San Francisco and helped draft the charter. The Arab League has 21 member states that goes all the way from from West Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. And Palestine is a member too. In fact, Palestine, the lot of the Palestinian people was one of the catalysts for why this regional organization came about. But again, it's a very interesting organization because it's not necessarily based on a specific element of geography, but in this case, it's a organization that is built on linguistic similarities. So these are essentially all countries where a majority of the population speaks Arabic. Now, there has been a movement that's been called Pan-Arabism. So the idea that the Arab world is one region. Remember, I talked to you earlier that the regionalization, so the empirical processes of the interlinkages, aren't always the same as regionalism. So sometimes you need actors that are actively driving to realize a regional political entity, a regional political project. In this case, the regional political project is Pan-Arabism. So the idea that the Arab world is connected and should therefore integrate and cooperate. And the Arab League has both been a product of this Pan-Arabism, but once it was founded, it has also been a driver of this, and it's tried to further integrate the Arab region. Now, there is a bit of a dilemma at the heart of the Arab League, and that is also the reason why you probably haven't heard a ton about it. There is a dilemma in that the Arab League was begun very much as a security-focused organization. It was designed to help the states of the region coordinate their security efforts. But the problem is this tends to be the hardest area to coordinate because that's the area where states are the least likely to give away authority to supranational institutions. On the other hand, cooperation in, say, cultural or economic matters is fairly easy, but that's not really the main problem that the region has. The main problem in the region has been one of security. So the Arab League has built quite a number of elaborate structures. They have their own security council, they have a shared parliamentary body, and so on. But it lacks a great number of success stories because whenever the Arab League has tried to take a more active role in, for example, intervening in conflicts in the region or at least coordinating their responses to conflicts, the states that make up the Arab League have always shied away from really further integrating in that matter and from taking decisive action. So it simply hasn't done a great deal, especially not in the area of security. It shouldn't be too unfair. It's not like that they do nothing, just that their main project, really safeguarding security all over the area, all over the region, really hasn't come to fruition. Now, if we can contrast this a little bit with the African Union. Now, you will notice, of course, that a number of states that were already a part of the Arab League are now also a part of the African Union. The African Union, again, has been around for quite a long time. It was founded as the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, in 1963, and it was effectively refounded in 2002 as the African Union. Now, you might notice that in this particular case, African Union sounds suspiciously similar to European Union, and you wouldn't be far off in this case, because here the comparisons to Europe are not only merited, but they are necessary. The African Union has 55 member states. All the states on the African continent are a member. Morocco wasn't a member for about 30 years because the African Union had allowed the territory of Western Sahara up here into the African Union. This is a state that's only partially been recognized, and it hasn't been recognized by Morocco, who still claims the territory. So in retaliation, Morocco decided to not be a part of the AU all the way until 2017. In Africa, just like in the Arab world, there is a strong undercurrent of Pan-Africanism. So the idea that that the African continent has things in common, and that the African continent should integrate and cooperate as a region, and that the states of the region should come together. This was a primary driver in creating the OAU and also in driving this to further integration in the shape of the AU. And since these organizations have been around, they have also furthered this idea that Africa is really one continuous region with states that have shared stakes. The African Union has been deliberately and very consciously modeled on the European Union. So almost any institution you see in the EU, you also have in the AU. So for example, the African Union has an assembly, it has a Pan-African Parliament, which works just like the European Parliament, has a commission in the same way as the European Commission, it has a court of justice, an executive council, and so on, all of which have direct equivalents in the EU, really. So very deliberately, this continent has tried to emulate a model that has worked for Europe in the hopes that that model will also lead to further integration in Africa. And so it's arguably the most institutionally sophisticated RO outside of the EU. The one thing that is really important in the case of Africa that doesn't play a large role in Europe is that the regional economic communities are really important. So remember that graph I showed you a couple of slides ago? All these things here, like ECOWAS, CMAC, IGAD, and so on, all these things actually haven't gone away. They are still there as organizations, but they now essentially serve as subsidiaries of the African Union. So lots of the time, the states of the African Union will try to coordinate much of their work through these regional organizations, through these sub-African regional organizations before they bring this to the EU. Now there's very far-ranging plans for Africa as a continent. So lots and lots of political and economic integration is at least aimed for, not all of which are uncontentious. So there's actually a lot of conflict and a lot of debate and discussion around how exactly you can integrate this continent, both politically and economically. The EU has been very successful and very involved already in regional peacekeeping. So the United Nations has a more or less a rule that if a regional organization wants to take the lead in pacifying a regional conflict, then it should get priority over a UN mission. And the EU has in fact sent its own blue helmet soldiers into a number of conflicts, try to intervene and also pacified some of them. So this is an organization that has great plans, has already done quite a lot, and is aiming to integrate the entire African continent. Now compare this to another organization on the other side of the world, the Organization of American States. You see almost all the states of the Americas are in this. Cuba hasn't been a member since 2009. For reasons that will become evident in just a second. French Guiana is also another member, but that doesn't matter as much as Cuba. Now, again, in the Americas, there is a political project of Pan-Americanism. So the idea that America as a continent should come together, should integrate and cooperate in institutionalized form. The OAS is different from both the Arab League and the African Union, and of course also the European Union, in that it has a very light institutional structure. It's really just a diplomatic forum where states meet and a kind of a bare bones secretariat. There's not a ton else going on. There's, for example, no inter-American parliament or something like that, especially not one with any powers. Now, the OAS has Cold War roots, so for a long period of its existence, it was dominated by the power asymmetry between the US on the one side and basically every other state in the Americas. There is, of course, a huge power asymmetry here, both economically, but also politically and militarily, especially. With the US essentially considering the Americas a bit of its backyard in that regard. And it's no accident then that when the OAS was founded, its main goal was to promote democracy as a form of statehood in the Americas. Now, you might or might not have to be a cynic to see that essentially the OAS was for a long time considered to be a vehicle for the US to meddle in regional affairs, and that this promotion of democracy was really just a thinly veiled attempt at bringing into power regimes that the US liked. Now, the OAS has always been dominated by this discussion. Cuba leaving was to a large part driven by the allegation that the US was really the dominating actor in here and that they were using this regional organization simply for their own goals. The OAS has been especially important in election monitoring, which then can sometimes lead to charges that states aren't run democratically enough, which of course is also true for some of the states in Latin America. It's not that this is all just coming out of thin air. The modern day problem that the OAS has is that there's a really dense institutional landscape in the Americas. In North America, a little less so than in Latin America, but if you think back to the previous slide where I showed you all those regional organizations in the Americas, that means you have a ton of competition and you have to fight as a regional organization. You have to fight for states to use you. You want to be an attractive forum for states, of course. And that can be quite hard if there's other organizations that have much more far-reaching goals, both politically, economically, and socially. So lastly then, we move to Asia. Let's look at an Asian regional organization, and concretely the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. ASEAN again has been around for quite a long time, since 1967. Its membership is almost unchanged since then. So it has 10 members, all the way from Myanmar here in the east, all the way to Indonesia here Indonesia and the Philippines here in the west. And the interesting thing about ASEAN is that it's a fairly sophisticated organization in a very sparsely institutionalized region. So Asia simply doesn't have a ton of regional organizations when you compare it to all other world regions. Partially that's driven by the fact that there is no real pan-Asian movement or a pan-Asian organization. Certainly not to the same degree as there is in the Americas, in Europe, or in Africa. ASEAN really just began as an attempt at emulating EFTA or NAFTA, so a regional free trade agreement. And it still has a very light structure. It has a secretariat, but really not that much else. Everything else is kind of decided on in these yearly forums where the states come together and then go apart. The respect for national sovereignty is a dominant principle here, so actually ever stronger integration isn't necessarily what these states are in for. They want to very much preserve their own sovereignty while also cooperating regionally a little bit. There's a limited amount of delegation, and it's strictly intergovernmental, just like I said. And it has, in recent years, tried to position itself as an alternative to other ways of regional integration. It has tried to promote something called the ASEAN Way. So a strong insistence on non-interference in domestic affairs, a sort of informal institutionalism that is not driven by much hard law at the regional level, but more by soft consensus and so on. And so could this possibly be an alternative to this really hard law, deep integration style of European integration that, say, a continent such as Africa is also seemingly trying to emulate? So you see a vast span of regional organizations all across the world, but what we do see is that regionalism, the political project, is a global phenomenon. It's been around for quite a long time, and it's there in all continents. Now, a different way of looking at this could be an economical one. So there has been, for example, a proliferation of regional trade agreements. If you've paid any attention in the IPE lectures on last year's ICEP, you might already have heard of this. So you know that these are things that are less than a regional organization. So they're not an attempt at creating a big political project that covers a region, but they are projects at interlinking regions economically. So regional trade agreements have been on the rise ever since they've been introduced in sort of the late 1950s. And you see this graph is a little bit flat, and then once the Cold War is over, it basically is on a linear rise to the number that we are now. We have about 470 regional trade agreements in force at the moment. And we have a lot more that have been enforced but now are defunct. But so this is another big trend in regionalism. Besides just regional organizations, now regional trading agreements. Just as an example, all the things in color are states with which the EU has tried to create free trade agreements, is in negotiation with free trade agreements, or has already signed them but just not implemented them. So clearly this is a very broad trend all around the world. Okay, so now that we have a good understanding of the kind of descriptive phenomenon, yes, there has been increasing regionalization and increasing regionalism, let's think a little bit about the causes. What could be the explanatory factors in all of this. One good way, I think, to split these up to get a little bit more of a systematic understanding of what brings about regionalization, so the further integration, the further interlinking of the states of a region, is to split them into exogenous and endogenous factors. So exogenous factors is everything that acts on a region from the outside and could potentially make it more interlinked. So could entice states to create stronger regional interdependencies. So for example, these could be economic factors. So, the pressures of globalization, for example. They could be political factors. So the way that the world is essentially ordered and structured could incentivize states to bind together regionally, for example, to balance against a hegemon outside of it. There could also be global challenges. So, for example, the dangers of conflict, of poverty, of migration, and so on. I'm not saying, by the way, that migration is a danger. It's just a challenge for states, of course. So all kinds of forces that happen outside of a region and that make the states in the region think that the best way to face these challenges is to create regional processes and regional structures. So one example here is Karl Polanyi's idea of a new regionalism. And then there could be endogenous factors. So that's everything that would drive regional interlinkages from the inside, so from inside the region itself. So it could, for example, be that you have a number of states that have common histories, that have common legal systems, common political traditions, and so on. And that makes regional cooperation for them rather easy and maybe especially enticing. You could have the interests of specific powerful actors within those member states driving regionalism as a project. So, for example, if business is very regionally integrated, for example, in Europe or in Asia, then maybe those businesses also want to incentivize their states to follow other regional projects that can then reinforce these notions of regional value chains, for example. And of course, you could have dynamics of spillover. We already talked about spillover in the section on the EU. And there could be a certain socialization effect being brought about, for example, by projects of regionalism. So remember, sometimes you might have projects of regionalism that are there before the region is actually all that integrated, before the region is actually all the way regionalized. So this tends to be the case, for example, in places such as Africa, where you had a Pan-African political project and thinking before there really was much of a regional integration of that area. So both exogenous and endogenous factors can both drive processes of regionalization. So let's think a little bit more about these theories, about these explanations. Now, lots of the newer thinkers in this, especially those in the vein of the new regionalism literature that came after Karl Polanyi, focus on the relationship between regionalization and globalization. So the idea that a further interlinking of regions is driven by common pressures exerted by globalization. Polanyi has this really interesting idea here of globalization as a double movement. So the first thing is that globalization does expand and deepen international markets. So the idea that globalization opens up the world and makes everything more interconnected, essentially. But then it also has in itself already the seeds for a counter movement. So, of course, this opening up the world, this neoliberal idea of further interlinking and opening up economies creates all kinds of problems. So there's market distortions, market dislocations that are happening, of course, based on globalization as a trend that then might necessitate states to actually counteract it with interventionist approaches or with other measures designed to counteract the effects that globalization has. So Polanyi essentially says that regionalism tries to combine both things. It both tries to open up regions for more interconnections, but it also tries to protect them by regionally integrating from the pressures that that globalization might exert on the region. So essentially, we're we're making the region itself more interconnected, and therefore we're protecting it against the possible negative effects that come in from outside of that region. So the European Union, for example, is both a project of liberalization inside of it, but also of social policy and protection against forces from outside of it. And I think that's kind of an interesting figure of thought here. Now let's translate this new regionalism. Let's translate some of these ideas. Let's translate some of these theories into concrete research designs. How can we investigate these kinds of phenomena that we've seen, these regional phenomena, into actual research designs? So, for example, we could ask the question why regional trade agreements have proliferated so much, mostly since 1994, but also before that already we saw that the trend was at least slowly rising. So why have there been so many regional projects of trade liberalization? Now, we could have a theory. Our theory could very generally be following Polanyi, for example, and say that economic globalization creates certain incentives. So it creates incentives to form regional trading blocs to ensure free trade within that, but also to mitigate against negative effects that could happen if all trade just came in freely from outside of that region. So, in other words, we want to maximize the freedom inside the region, but still protect our citizens' welfare and the rights. So, the dependent variable here would be the formation of regional trade agreements. So, how many regional trade agreements have there been formed in any given region? Now, Polanyi says that, well, the more globalization is happening, the more globalization is exerting its pressures on regions, the more regional trade agreements should we also expect as a counter movement to this globalization. So the hypothesis would be the greater the pressures of globalization, the more countries will form these regional trading blocs and form RTAs. And of course, the greater the pace of economic liberalization, the more such trade blocs will then develop regulations that are trying to ward off the negative social effects that come with an opening up of your economy. And one possibility to investigate this could be with a most different systems design. Now, I don't know if you've heard of MDSD already, the most different systems design. The idea here is a rather simple one. We take a lot of different cases, so a lot of different world regions, for example, that are all very, very different. There's a lot of different states in there at different times and so on, but they all formed regional trade agreements. So what we then would do is, in all these very different cases, we hunt for the one thing that they all have in common. So the one factor that binds them all together, all these different regions, that could then explain why they all also form regional trade agreements. And at least in the Polanyi literature on new regionalism, he really says that, well, that variable that all the regions have in common are the pressures of globalization. So since the pressures of globalization exert their force on all regions equally, all regions form these regional trade agreements, even though everything else about these regions is different. Now, there's a couple of problems maybe with that explanation, as valid as that might sound. And that is that some regions are a lot more effective at forming regional trading blocs. So, for example, the EU tends to adopt these things much more quickly than, say, organizations in the Americas. And it also disregards the role of endogenous factors, so things that happen inside of regions. So if we just chalk everything up to global forces of globalization exerting pressures on all the regions, then we essentially disregard all the different regional integration histories and institutions already existing there. Also, some regions have more elaborate regulatory regimes than others. So in other words, even though the pressures of globalization might be the same, they don't result in exactly the same outcomes. So yes, you could say that there has been a regional trade agreement being signed, but they're not all the same. They have different regulatory regimes. Again, the EU is much more extensive than other world regions. And again, this, if we just chalk everything up to globalization, we forget a lot of endogenous factors. So at least some critics have argued that a theory of new regionalism that just says that globalization is making everyone regionally integrate, both economically and politically, is overgeneralized. So these are overly abstract and they lose a lot of the important variation. We've already seen that not all regional organizations are the same. Regional trade agreements are also not all the same. So how do we explain that variation given that globalization is a force that acts on everyone? Now, one possible solution could be that we just adopt a different case design. So if we now know that regulatory regimes are different, so regional trade agreements are different between different regions, maybe that's what we need to explain then. How do we explain that variation? As is done by Francesco Duina in an article from 2006, or in a book from 2006, I should say. And so what he proposes is that it's actually the laws and regulations of that particular region reflect the dominant laws of and traditions of the states that are participating in this. So essentially states are trying to elevate their national legal systems to the regional level. And once these things are in place, they then become self-reinforcing because the people that act and the people and the states that act within these frameworks will then become institutionalized and they will reinforce this over time. So the dependent variable here is not whether or not regions create regional trade agreements, but rather what explains the variation between them. So why are some regional trade agreements set up in some way and others are set up in a different way? And the independent variable is at least what Duina suggests is, well, we should really look at national systems and power dynamics, because really what happens here is that national level variation is exported to the regional level, and because not all regions have states with the same legal arrangements and traditions in them, that then generates different regional organizations and different regional trade agreements. So the more similar these states should be, the more developed should be the RTA regulations. So because of course it's more easy to export national legal systems to the regional level if all those national systems are already very similar. While if they're very dissimilar, it might be very, very difficult to settle on one way to arrange this at the regional level. And the more intense the regulatory integration, the more national organizations will become active, and so this becomes another self-reinforcing dynamic. The way that we should investigate this then in a comparative case study design could be a most similar systems design. So we find a lot of different cases that are ideally very similar. So we find a lot of regional trade agreements that have a lot of things in common, but they are displaying one key element of variation in regulatory outcomes. And so what we're then doing is we're hunting for the thing that differs across these cases, because if the cases are all very similar, but the outcomes are dissimilar, what we're on the hunt for is the one factor that varies across the cases. That is how most similar systems designs work. Now, there is, of course, weaknesses in both these approaches, and that is pointed out by Lombard and his co-authors Söderbaum and van Langenhove and Baird. And they say really, well, look, we have to take a middle-of-the-road approach. Yes, we need to avoid overgeneralized theory, so we can't just use large N studies all the time. Because really these theories of new regionalism that rely on this, that say, for example, that the pressures of globalization explain everything, they lose a lot of explanatory power because they can't ever really explain variation. They can just say that, yes, regionalism projects are there or not, but they can't really explain much of variation because their explanatory factor is the same for every unit in the study. But they say, we also have to avoid exaggerated contextualization, so we can't just rely on single case studies and process tracing, because then what happens is essentially we fall back to this European model of early theory building, where we really build a theory that only works for one specific case, and then we can't generalize anything to anything else. So these suggest that there should be an eclectic center, so a perspective of comparative studies where we take a comparative approach really without overgeneralizing, but also without really only focusing on one case, ideally by combining quantitative and qualitative methods. So that brings us to the end then, to my summary. I would have shown you a little bit of my own research with some fancy schmancy graphs, but really this lecture was already too long, so I didn't want to add that in there. Maybe I'll bring it up in the live stream next week. So in summary, regionalism varies a lot around the world. So the way in which regions around the world have set up regional projects is not the same. And early theories didn't really take this into account because they only had to explain one specific project of regional integration, and that was the European one. We run into challenges whether we focus on exogenous or endogenous factors, really, because both perspectives by themselves can rarely really explain all about how regional integration works. And really what we need to do is we need to balance abstraction and generalization, ideally by comparing the right number of regional organizations, regional trade agreements, or other regional projects across our data set. We might have fewer units when we compare this, but that also means that we might have more obvious variation between regional units as we compare these. So, regional integration is a global phenomenon. It's there all around the world. It has a lot of really interesting variation. Lots of regions are setting up their projects in very different ways. And our charge is now to come up with good overarching theories that can explain why this happens and how it happens. Okay, this was my last lecture on the course. I really enjoyed this. I'm going to say a little more in the live stream then. But if you followed me so far, you've seen me all the way through ICEB, all the way through comparative politics. Can you even imagine? We started months and months ago by talking about, how theories work and all that. Anyway, I really enjoyed the ride. Thanks for coming along. Thanks for being interested. I hope you learned a little bit, and I wish you all the best for your honors years. Cheers. Thanks very much. I'll see you soon, hopefully.